Hello everyone, welcome back to another Bible study and episode review in Shady Oak Ministries. I'm of course Shady Oak, and today we're going to be discussing episode 10 of season 6 of the TV show My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic, the episode Applejack's Day Off. If you could join me in the book of Matthew chapter 11 and verse 28, we're actually going to get to discuss how Jesus views our work schedules as well as our vacation times. And knowing that both are important, we're going to also be discussing how God warns us against the hazard of routines. Genesis chapter 11, verse 28. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Now, for those of you who are familiar, a yoke is actually the same thing that Big Macintosh wears around his neck. It's a wooden harness that is specially tailor-designed and fitted for a beast of burden. Not to say that Big Macintosh a beast, except in workout terms, but that's another story. But it was essentially made for the purpose of, if you were going to tie a plow or luggage, carriage, anything, to a beast of burden, that when they were carrying it, it was custom fitted for them so that it wouldn't chafe, be disproportionate or uncomfortable, and it would be able to be an easier process in being able to use its weight instead of having to constantly adjust yourself to the yoke because it's not fitted for you. And what Jesus is pointing out here is that if you come to Him for your purpose, you come to Him for your reason as to why you not only work, but also why you rest, you will find the very purpose for your existence. You'll find that ability to not only rest, but to work in a way that's perfectly fitted for you. Today's study is discussing how Applejack got caught into two sides of both extremes in which we are going to be discussing today. But before we get into that, I want to put the Bible first, because ultimately that is what the intention of this channel is for, to use My Little Pony to point us back to Scripture, not the other way around. So if we're going to properly understand practically in our lives, even through illustrations like MLP, what was the original purpose for our work? What was God's plan and intention as to how we're supposed to approach labor? And it was this: the reason why we can not only enjoy Him in our rest, but also the reason we can enjoy the life He's given us in the purpose that He's given. In the beginning, when He created the heavens and the earth, in Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 2, it says, when He completed His entire creation, He rested on the seventh day and set that aside as a special occasion. Now, did God have to rest? Obviously not. His power's not limited. It's not like He had a clipboard going all Twilight OCD and saying like, we haven't turned on that yet, and oh, I still got a few more stars over here, and oh man, and then just by the time He was bushed, He just had to take it off. No, that's not it at all. He created the heavens and the earth with His feet up. He could have snapped it all into existence and left us behind in the dust, but the reason why He created things in the way that He did was not only set an example, but a standard for us as to how we're supposed to view our lives. That it's one day at a time, one thing at a time, one purpose at a time, one focus at a time, and when it's all finished, you can rest and enjoy Him. And He set this down as a standard, actually, in verse 15 of chapter 2, the same chapter, by the way, in which He rested. He also gave man his purpose, to tend the Garden of Eden. Now, note that labor, that sweat, that thorns, that thistles, that unfruitful crops weren't a thing until after we had separated ourselves from God. But even in God's perfect law, He still tells us to take a day off. In we already discussed Genesis. In Exodus chapter 20 and verse 8, the fourth commandment in God's perfect law tells us to take a day off. God invented the weekend based on the Mosaic law. In pagan societies and cultures that lived with many gods, they thought that life depended on them always having to get work done, and them having to do everything because they are the only source of strength, the only source of dependability, and the only one who's going to care for their own interests. But when God founded His nation as the exception to the world's rule, He said, show the world what it's like to serve a real God, where you don't have to work yourself to death to be happy, to be safe, to be secure. There's nothing wrong with work. I'm the one who gave you that purpose. But that's the whole issue, is that when we separate ourselves from the very reason why we work, then we get caught up in routines. and they end up replacing the one we're working for. And in the same way, when we begin to take breaks without knowing who's the one who's taking care of us, we are neglecting responsibilities, not freeing ourselves from the burden of them. And that's the whole point. In the fourth commandment, it says, you shall remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male or female servant, those who work for you, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days, what does it say? The Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the Sabbath day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So God's example, God's priority, God's real focus for us in a perfect world was, even in his perfect law, to serve him, to work, and to also understand that 6 days you work, but the seventh day you rest, because I know your needs. I created you, by the way. I know how that mechanism works. I know how you're going to get the most out of it. But also understand when we lost sight of our Creator, the purpose for our vacations, the purpose for our labor. When we separated ourselves from him, we only have then ourselves and our routines to fill that void. And that's what we're going to talk about today in today's study, is that in today's episode we actually saw two illustrations that were pointed out to us in the life of Jesus regarding the things that we can get caught up in, regarding that replacement of God rather than the celebration of what God's given us to do. The first extreme I'd like to talk to you about is in the book of Matthew chapter 12 and verses 1 through 8. Now as I'm reading this, I want you guys to listen, because those of you who've been with us for any length of time, you'd probably be able to catch on what is being talked about here. What do we see in today's episode that was actually based on this chapter in Jesus' life? Matthew 12 verse 1. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. So we're all clear on the law. And his disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath. But he said to them, Have you not read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for them to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests. Or have you not read that in the law, on the Sabbath, the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? The priests work on the Sabbath. You don't see them breaking the law. Yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now understand, what Jesus is saying here is kind of a triple diss towards the Pharisees, because they were reputationally known to have the entire Old Testament committed to memory. And when Jesus points out and says, Have you read 1 Samuel? That's like the first chapter in their ideal history. That's their first king, man. Well, Saul was the first king, but their first good king, right? I mean, of course we know David. He was perfect. Wait, didn't he eat the bread that was only lawful in the Torah for the priest to eat? Was he sinning? Or did God care more about his hunger than obeying rules and regulations and traditions? What about the priests? They actually work twice as hard on the Sabbath day because of all the sacrifices you're bringing in. We as pastors, do we take Sunday off? No, that's actually one of the biggest work days of the week for us. We spend all this time preparing and making sure this building's handy. That's when you come in, and then we have to clean up after you as well as address you. So here's the point. Jesus is saying it's not as much about the routine as it is the one who actually set the rules in place. I'm the one who wrote it, I'm the voice that penned it, and I'm the heart that decided these things were the way you were going to function. Now, here's also the funny thing, is when they were saying it is not lawful for you to do what you're doing on the Sabbath, what they were talking about was not them going into some stranger's field and eating grain. That was actually in the law as a provision for the poor. Because in the Old Testament, and as well in Israel today, as well as I believe it should be in most places, in fact, all will be one day, the provisions for the poor and the needy, people who are down on their luck when things just go wrong in life, if you were a fatherless, if you were a widow, or if you were just a traveler and you got hungry, God specifically commanded that when you harvest a field, you are to not go back a second time. And you're also to leave alone the corners. If you drop wheat, leave it, for it is for the poor. So that way, you wouldn't be given government housing, food stamps, and all of these handouts. What you would get is the opportunity to go out and work to gather enough food to satisfy your hunger. That way there would be incentive to go out and get a job, but also understanding that God wasn't going to leave you to starve. You would go out and you'd gather enough wheat. You couldn't carry it away in a basket, go grocery shopping in your neighbor's field. But if you needed it, God says, I provided it. That wasn't the issue. What the Pharisees were actually talking about was the traditions of what was called the Talmud. And the Talmud was the oral traditions of the Pharisees, not inspired by God, but the interpretations of what was inspired by God, the law of Moses, the Torah, which the Pharisees also committed to memory. And the funny thing was, the Talmud contained hundreds of different interpretations as to how we think the law should be interpreted. So I'd say the best example is it actually deduced down to a letter how you're supposed to properly spit on the Sabbath. That if you spit into dirt, you've made clay. That's work. You can't spit in clay. You can only spit on concrete because then the water just immerses and evaporates, and that's no big deal. And Jesus is like, you're spending too much time discussing logiology and not theology. Why don't you focus on this? And that's the whole point that Jesus was making. He's saying, your traditions don't mean anything to me. We're talking about the law here. We're talking about human need and hunger. And don't you think God cares more about human life than just making sure you're obeying all of the traditions and rules? And he really gets them for a turn on this, because just like we see here, they were stressing, well, for all intents and purposes, they were making the Sabbath, the day off, by all these rules and regulations and traditions, routines, saying it's now more stressful to follow the day off than a normal work week. It's more complicated to actually obey God's law than to enjoy it. And that's the saddest part. Because here's the thing, just like we saw in today's episode, what was AJ's routine in feeding the pigs? Oh, she had a big, long list of all the things that Twilight was supposed to do. But when it ultimately came down to it, what was the end result? Put the slop in the trough, the pigs come and eat. They're not picky. Now note, at one point, in specific circumstances, I'm sure clucking like a chicken and hanging the corn by jumping off the barn and opening and closing the door and walking around and getting all that exercise, it might be good for your numbers on your Fitbit, but it's ultimately not getting the pigs fed faster. It was important in that specific situation, but what was the meaning of Applejack giving the chore to feed the pigs? It was to feed the pigs. Food, trough, done. Interesting. Now, with this also in mind, understand that she fell into the same mistake of idolizing a routine when she was regarding fixing fences or watering cabbage. She was doing more work than was necessary. And that's the interesting thing, is that Jesus doesn't care about how much work you're doing. He's just giving you work so that you can enjoy the opportunity to serve him, because there's a blessing there. But also understand, just like too much work can be a bad thing, too little is also another extreme we need to avoid in routines. Continuing on to verse 9 of chapter 12. When he had departed from there, he went into their synagogue, and behold, there was a man who had a withered hand. And the Pharisees, they asked him, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Now they knew the answer to that. In the Talmud, not the Torah, the Talmud, their traditions, their routine, you can't heal somebody. You could just prevent the loss of life. You're allowed to, if someone was bleeding out, for instance, they had gotten an injury and you needed to, were put in a place where you could help them. Obviously, it's pure evil to just neglect them. It's like, sorry, it's the Sabbath. Make sure you haven't bled out by Monday and then we'll help you out. No. They could apply a tourniquet, but you couldn't apply a bandage until the sun had gone down. Why is that? Well, the healing process causes the body to work, and God doesn't want us to work on Saturdays. You're just as confused as Jesus was. Because understand, when they said it is lawful to heal on the Sabbath, it gives us their motives. It says that they might accuse him. They literally set up this man in physical need and said, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Now, you think the man with the withered hand's like, bad, good. This isn't complicated. Hashtag Brad Stein. But when Jesus saw this, he said to them, what man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? How much more value, then, is a man than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other. Now here's the saddest part. It says that the Pharisees then went out and plotted against him, how they might destroy him. This was the incident that began the avalanche that would ultimately result in the Pharisees deciding, we have to kill Jesus. That even though they didn't realize they were saying this, they were saying, we have to kill God because he doesn't follow our routines. It's no wonder then in the Gospel of Mark that when he records this incident, he makes the note that when Jesus saw the hardness of their hearts, he became angry. What ticks God off more than anything else? It's people using his word to neglect people who are suffering, because they've missed the whole point. And understand that just like we see this here, that it's equally as foolish to allow life to be miserable for doing things the way they've always been done, that Aloe also fell into this routine, didn't she? Because she wanted to do things the way they've always been done, it caused her to neglect water leaks, neglect the availability of the steam room, and this routine caused laziness just as much and basically more problems than the previous one, and causing too much work caused. Because guess what? Which issue actually caused them to want to murder their Messiah? Understand then that in conclusion, we need to understand that routines are a very dangerous habit to get into, because not only do we do them so blindly, but we also defend them so dumbly. The Applejack is literally explaining the philosophy of everything that people do that's sometimes foolish, while she is then making a fool of herself in the same time. That's why she's best pony, because she has the willingness to actually learn from her mistakes. And I pray that you would too. Because understand, just like God has laid down warnings exemplified in his life of the danger of routines, but also pointing out the solution and how to avoid them altogether. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 17. Whatever you do, in word or in deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Understand, God's emphasis isn't on you getting work done or you taking work off. Whatever you do, all he cares about is who you're doing it for. Because if you focus on the one who gave you the purpose to work, you'll not only know how to work, but how to work right, to remember the focus as to what you're there to do in the first place, but also how to take breaks, to take rest, to take vacation. If you understand that God doesn't want you here so that he could wring you out like a dry tile and then hang you over the rack like some cloth, but actually to give you a job that you're going to enjoy doing, to equip you for those said works, you can be most fitted to accomplish it. In the same way that an ox is to a yoke. He's designed you for the purpose, not to work, not to rest, but that in everything to enjoy him. If he's your focus, then you won't lose sight of your purpose. And if you won't lose sight of your purpose, you'll spend a lot less time wondering if you're doing something right and a lot more time enjoying the one who is. Thank you for your time and listening to this study. I hope it's been a blessing to you. If you have any questions or would like to know more about the topics we've discussed today, leave them in the comments below. Sincerity will always be matched with clarity. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, you know where to go, but most importantly, if you know someone who perhaps is getting trapped in the routines of life, who's probably, for all intents and purposes, lost focus of what matters most, please share this study with anyone and everyone you feel would be blessed by it. Thank you for your time in listening to this study, and once again remember, Jesus loves you.